So, Andrew, why don't you, my suggestion is just speak a little bit as a physicist,
right,
as a quantum physicist, explain what goes through the mind or through the I would say, stream of consciousness of a physicist when he hears about quantum physics, being yoked with consciousness studies. What would some of the resistances be? Who are the people who come to mind, and what would some of the caveats be?
Right.
Just talk about that a little bit.
That's great. Yes. So the basic idea linking quantum mechanics and consciousness has been around for at least a few decades, with the idea being we don't really understand consciousness in any kind of deep way, or even possibly even in a shallow way. But yet we identify there are some aspects of quantum mechanics that were also strange and don't really fit into a kind of a mechanistic worldview, but we understand quantum mechanics quantitatively accurately, and so we understand how it works. It's our best scientific theory of nature. We use it to explain all kinds of things, and so the question is, does quantum mechanics have anything to do with consciousness, or how might we be able to answer that question in a scientific way? And so there have been some different ideas over the years. So there was this book by Roger Penrose, for example, The Emperor's New Mind, in which he has this hypothesis, maybe somehow this microtubules have some kind of quantum coherence. They play some role in cognitive brain function in terms of consciousness. That's one such idea. There are old ideas about quantum mechanics itself, about the role of quantum measurements, so the fact that, why is it that we make a measurement, the wave function is collapsing at this point? People have different ideas about this, but one such idea has been perhaps the role of the observer is very critical in this function. So maybe this idea of consciousness plays a role in the wave function collapse. And if that's true, then perhaps it goes deeper that our minds themselves have some kind of critical quantum role to play. So that's been another idea that has been posited. And so there are these ideas, for example, by John Wheeler is also another name that comes to mind. So John Wheeler had some also interesting speculative ideas about something like a self-creating universe, that the universe existed in kind of a quantum superposition, but it took the existence of conscious observers to be able to collapse the wave function, to be able to bring itself into existence. So he has this interesting cartoon of a universe sort of looking in on itself and causing its own creation. So these are also some of the more speculative ideas that people have come up with over the years. In terms of actually making a scientific case for this role of consciousness, the quantum mechanics and the consciousness, so people have obviously there are a lot of problems with that. So one of the big problems is the fact that when you go out in nature to look for quantum effects, they occur in things like atoms, right? So the light from our fluorescing tubes is, you can say, is a quantum mechanical effect. And so, but usually, if you want to have controlled quantum systems like a quantum computer, or even controlled experiments where you understand, try to probe quantum behavior, new effects in quantum behavior.
Good timing. So come around. We'll give you a mic. We just started, so this is good. I hope it wasn't too difficult to find.
No, this was the first store I saw when I walked up the elevator, so I thought I couldn't possibly get it. So I looked at the other door on the floor, but now I'm back.
Did you get my email? The one that I just sent you about where we are? No, that's okay. Good. Good. So what we're doing, Jim.
Yeah, can you, is this working? Is this volume okay? Okay.
We're not introducing ourselves, okay? We will do that through some kind of a small textual, blurb. When you start speaking, it's gonna show. Mm-hmm. So you can just speak your mind and say whatever you want to say. Okay. Don't worry about what comes out. We'll try to edit it to the best of our ability and show it to you at the end. All right?
Fine.
And we're going to do it in this way. Andrew's going to talk a little bit about, in general, a quantum physicist approach to thinking about consciousness and merging quantum physics and consciousness. A little bit from Calvin, a little bit from me, a little bit from you. Just what comes to your mind when you hear about these things. And then we'll try to sort of narrow the conversation a little bit. Mm-hmm. Okay? So why don't you back up just a little bit,
yeah.
And then move forward.
Okay. All right, so where was I?
I think you were just talking about measurements and
Yeah,
the collapse of...
Right, okay, good. And so this has led people to believe that perhaps consciousness has some role to play in the foundations of quantum mechanics, and if so, then perhaps quantum mechanics itself is playing some critical role in consciousness. Maybe consciousness has something to do with quantum mechanics in a deep way. And so yes, I was thinking about how would you be able to test that. So if we want to make a scientific program to actually pose this question, it has to be done in a scientifically rigorous way, which means we have to identify operational, observable questions that we can put tests to, be able to collect data, do experiments, and so on, to be able to do that. And so one of the obstacles about having a quantum role in the brain is that when we try to describe quantum mechanics, so for example, the kind of quantum mechanics I work on is usually done that are probing quantum effects that are building up quantum superpositions of atoms or other elemental degrees of freedom, are typically done at very, very cold temperatures. So for example, a lot of the work that I did in the beginning of my career was on semiconductor quantum systems, and those are all done at typically millikelvin temperatures. And so I'm also working on quantum superconducting circuits, and those are also done in dilution refrigerators at very cold temperatures. We don't have to worry about temperature coming along and spoiling many of these effects. So one of the big things that we fight in those kind of experiments is a process called decoherence, which is basically what happens is that you end up interacting or leaking into some other degrees of freedom in your environment that you don't have access to, you can't control, and so you lose your ability to control your system. And so the quantum coherent effects that you're interested in, or entanglement, those are very fragile effects, and they're very easy to degrade when you have coupling to some kind of thermal environment or even a well-controlled cold environment. And so when you start thinking about quantum physics in the brain, I mean, there are different hierarchies of quantum physics. So on this most hotly researched areas today, things like entanglement, quantum algorithms, trying to have entangled states of many quantum degrees of freedom. Those are typically very, very fragile quantum states, and they're very hard to preserve in that state for a very long period of time. So in terms of that kind of physics, I think for me anyway, it seems very difficult to imagine that kind of physics going on in the brain at all, much less affecting kind of conscious thought. But I could be wrong about that. On the other hand, there are also hierarchies of quantum physics. So if we start at the other end, the fact that we have that our atoms in this table, for example, are able to be held together. These are all ultimately quantum effects that are holding our very world together, right? And so that's sort of the basic quantum level effects we're talking about. There are other kind of quantum effects that are between sort of an atomic structure kind of effect and these entangled many-body quantum states. And I think you mentioned earlier, for example, the topic of quantum tunneling. So if you look at these controlled experiments in quantum physics, as I start turning up my temperature, as I start turning up decoherence, you can still see quantum effects without quantum coherence, so to speak. So for example, in quantum dot type experiments, you can have systems where I have electrons coming into some structure. The structure still behaves in a quantum way. It still has a discrete quantum energy level, but I simply don't have coherence between the energy levels, right? So the fact that the discrete energies are still quantum effects, even though I don't have the coherence between them. So I can have systems, for example, where I have electrons coming in from one barrier into a quantum dot, and the way they come in is typically through a quantum tunneling process. So I can tunnel in, I can live in this dot for a while, and then come out, for example, another lead, again through a quantum tunneling process that is not coherent, so to speak, but is also certainly a quantum process, right? And so what you see experimentally is that if you heat the system up further and further, you have other kinds of effects where I can still have transport through this quantum dot, but it happens through an activation process where I have a thermal kick, that the thermal environment gives me a kick of energy. I go over a barrier, this is an activation process, and then it happens again. So this is, as I go up in temperature, you have this sort of series of effects. And so I could imagine, you might have a series of hypothetical quantum effects that may exist in biological samples, and maybe we can come back and talk about more generally the ideas of quantum mechanics and biology in a little while. But you could imagine having a series of ideas about, I'm going to test to see if this effect exists, to see if that effect exists, and try to understand by doing experimentation, what effects you may or may not see. So why don't I'd stop there for the first round.
Kelvin, you want to talk a little bit about what goes through your mind when you hear about quantum physics and consciousness?
Sure. So I guess the most immediate connection that I see between physics, first and foremost, and consciousness would be through complexity theories of consciousness. So there's a lot of empirical data nowadays suggesting that consciousness has something to do with some sort of complexity. We find that, for example, by comparing, say, the conscious cerebral cortex and the non-conscious cerebellum. The cerebellum has 3 times as many neurons than the cerebral cortex, yet the one with less neurons is conscious. So what's the difference between the two? What are the neurons doing in one and not the other? That leads to consciousness. And one observation is that the neurons in the cerebral cortex are far more integrated or interconnected than the neurons in the cerebellum. And so that's one piece of evidence that suggests that complexity, interconnectivity is an important measure of consciousness. There are other empirical data I could use to sort of justify this claim, but this has led to, in modern neuroscience, attempts to formulate complexity theories of consciousness that attempt to give mathematical models of the relevant notion of complexity. And one that I've got quite interested in is the so-called integrated information theory of consciousness. Integrated information is just a particular measure of complexity, but it's a particularly useful one, and it can be motivated in various different ways. And it can be formulated relatively precisely, although there's still a lot of work nowadays trying to make it more precise. But our whole research program has been built around it. People are trying to come up with different ways, trying to measure it, and this has already engaged collaborations between neuroscientists and physicists. For example, you've got physicists, some working colleagues in Monash University in Melbourne, just using the resources within physics, an example being epsilon machines, to try and figure out a way of measuring integrated information in various systems, not just humans, but they're working on anesthetized flies, for example. Now, integrated information theory is all done in terms of classical physics. So what's the connection with quantum mechanics? Can it give us a connection with quantum mechanics? The initial connection that I see is going back to the idea that Andrew just talked about, the idea of potentially consciousness being the cause of the collapse of the quantum mechanical wave function. So in orthodox quantum mechanics, you have unitary deterministic evolution given by the Schrödinger equation. Up until the moment of measurement, when a measurement happens, you have this very mysterious, unexplained process called collapse. The wave function collapses when a measurement happens. And so it looks like textbook quantum mechanics is telling us that measurement is having this bizarre causal role in nature. It's stopping the deterministic unitary Schrödinger evolution and beginning this non-deterministic, probabilistic, non-unitary wave function collapse. But what on earth is measurement? And so this is a vibrant topic in contemporary foundations of quantum mechanics. What do we do about this measurement problem? And Nobel Prize-winning physicist Eugene Wigner said, well, why don't we say consciousness is the cause of collapse? That's not a particularly rigorous idea. There's this problem with how could we experimentally test for this? Because we don't have a prior notion of consciousness that we could use and say, okay, this theory tells us collapse happens then and there, because that's where consciousness is, therefore do the tests. But this is where I think integrated information theory can play a useful role in the foundations of quantum mechanics, because now we've got at least a proposal, an interesting proposal, for where and when consciousness is. It's correlated with integrated information. And so what you can do is you can convert the consciousness causes collapse hypothesis into the integrated information causes collapse hypothesis. And this I see as an interesting research program. It's very speculative, but I think it's important to look at the different. It's important for quantum physicists to look at the different interpretations of quantum mechanics that are out there, the different solutions to this measurement problem. Try and refute them if you can. If you can make them testable, try and refute them. This is how I think you can advance the field. And here, with the advent of these mathematical theories of consciousness, especially the integrated information theory, we've got at least the beginnings. We've got perhaps a window into how we could potentially test at least the combination of the consciousness causes collapse hypothesis with the integrated information theory of consciousness. Now, you mentioned the problem of testability. How could we test any proposal about when and where collapse happens? Interestingly, you've kind of got the opposite problem with this theory. It's too easy to test. At least if you think of the integrated information theory in the way that the founders of this theory have thought about it, in particular Giulio Tononi, Christoph Koh, and so forth. They are panpsychists. So they say consciousness is wherever integrated information is, but integrated information is everywhere. So even an example is when we fall asleep. So what's their analysis of what happens to consciousness when we fall asleep? Well, when we're awake, we have this gigantic part in the back of the brain, the so-called hotspot, that is a hotspot of integrated information. It is a maximum of integrated information in the human body. But when we fall asleep, this integrated information maximum breaks up into little integrated information maximum parts. So it breaks up. And what do we say about those parts? Those are maximum of integrated information, and they bite the bullet and they say, well, those are little pockets of consciousness. So they bite the bullet. They say, look, we have this evidence for a correlation between integrated information, this type of complexity, and consciousness. Yes, it's everywhere in smaller amounts. It has a vast amount. It's ramped up dramatically in the cerebral cortex, but it's there everywhere else in the universe. And so that means that we can actually test this hypothesis now. And so you might think, okay, if we can use a quantum computer to put a system into a superposition of two different states of integrated information, then we could refute this theory already. But where I think this is useful is we don't actually have to go the panpsychist route. We can step back a little bit and say, hey, integrated information, it's important for consciousness. But there might be other conditions relevant for consciousness. But at the very least, we can use quantum computers to, say, rule out this initial hypothesis of the full-blown Tononi-style integrated information theory and the consciousness causes collapse theory, and then try and rule things down to see the space of possibilities and how we can rule out different hypotheses, more restricted versions of the integrated information theory combined with the collapse hypothesis. Okay, so that's one place where I see quantum mechanics and consciousness and neuroscience combining. Another, perhaps a second one, and maybe I'll just let you say a little bit more about this, which is I think, so you've got these two processes in quantum mechanics. You've got this continuous deterministic unitary Schrodinger evolution, and then you've got this sudden random collapse. So you can think of this as two ways in which quantum mechanics could connect with consciousness research. I just talked about the latter, how you can connect consciousness with the collapse of the wave function, but perhaps you could connect consciousness instead with just unitary quantum mechanical processes like quantum computations. And this is where I think there's two very interesting projects I see at the moment. One is whether or not there are quantum computations going on inside microtubules and whether or not that could be associated with consciousness. So this is the idea from Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose. And then the other interesting idea coming from Fisher, which is perhaps it's certain tunneling processes connected with Posner molecules. Perhaps quantum mechanical processes like tunneling could be a source for ideas about relating consciousness to the brain. So that's, I guess, overview of where I see the main connections.
So that's very interesting because, from my perspective as a cognitive neuroscientist, when people come to me and they say, "Oh, did you consider quantum physics?" My immediate reaction, or at least my immediate reaction was, how can we even talk about quantum physics in the brain? The temperatures are too high. I mean, this is a biological tissue. Andrew was just talking before about what lengths he has to go through in order to make sure everything is very cold, so he doesn't have. And here we have, the human body, and we're talking, 36 degrees Celsius. How can we possibly talk about, quantum physics, or at least the superposition that we're hoping to see with coherence and entanglement and stuff like that? So that's my knee-jerk reaction without being a quantum physicist to these things. And some people, like Matthew Fisher and like other people, have suggested that there are ways to get around it. I have to say that from my own sort of neuroscience or brain perspective, I am a lot more partial to tunneling effects than to superposition effects. And the reason is that I just cannot see, with my limited understanding of quantum physics, I just cannot see how a superposition effect would occur at the level of the human brain if you consider it as a physical system. It's much easier for me to see tunneling effects at multiple levels, at the levels of ionic channels and other levels that we can talk about. The interesting thing, though, here is that I think that it's fairly easy to construct experiments where we would actually test very simple hypotheses about what happens, for example, with patient populations who are individuals who are suffering from a particular mental health condition and are already taking, let's say, lithium, and we can play around with the isotopic variation of the lithium. That would be very easy to do. But for that, I think we need a very clear quantum physics driven hypothesis as to what are we likely to see and why. And that's something that I've dabbled with, but I don't feel I have developed enough in order to put out there. The other route that I can see that would be very interesting is to sort of team up with a quantum computation approach slightly, and to say something like, look, instead of thinking about neurons, we can think about qubits, and we can think about all kinds of potential computations that are going on, or we can think about situations where you compute several things simultaneously, and then you're choosing something at the at the right moment based on something that is happening in the real world, or something like that. That's also an interesting perspective, perhaps, to think about, particularly with more and more quantum physicists going in a direction of quantum computation. And I think there's a genuine desire on their part to try to see what are some of the problems that a quantum computer can do that a classical computer cannot do, and maybe, just maybe, it is possible to demonstrate this, for example, with some kind of a brain application. Perhaps that's an interesting direction. And we have a lot of physicists who are not necessarily consciousness minded. I mean, people like Monroe in Maryland and other people are doing ion traps and things like that, where they're really trying to come up with physical manifestations of qubits that are not necessarily biologically inspired, but that might tell us something about perhaps some of the ability of the brain to compute things in a non-classical fashion. Now, the other inspiration that I have as a brain scientist is from the work of really great physicists who have, and Matthew Fisher would fall into this category, but people who have dedicated some time and sort of weighed in on some biological systems, doesn't matter if it's olfaction or auditory or visual, whatever, and showed that with quantum physics you can actually explain some of the computations that these biological systems are doing. And this has been done by Bialik at Princeton, by a whole slew of people who sort of dabbled in it for a few years or a little bit, and then disengaged and went on to other things. So maybe it's just a question of getting a cadre of such people together and probing them about what they think. But then the last thing that is sort of interesting for me from a brain perspective is just it's a very sort of mundane question, and that is, how does quantum physics, any aspect of quantum physics, help me to understand consciousness better? It's not entirely clear to me as somebody who's trying to study consciousness. And how do brain scientists study consciousness? I mean, they take people who have lesions, they have people who have neuropsychological syndromes, they take people who have strokes or very rare neurological disorders, or mental disorders, or all kinds of things like that, and you see what kind of computation their brain, sort of the impaired brain, is doing. You look at people who are taking psychedelic drugs, you look at people who are going through hypnosis, you're looking at people who are all kinds of altered consciousness, and you see what happens to their computation of consciousness. What does it do to them? What happens under anesthesia? These are fascinating questions, but my question is, what is quantum physics adding to our understanding, to our interpretation, to even, I would say, our construction or conceptual understanding of the problem? And it's not always clear to me what it adds, other than the fact to say quantum physics is really mysterious and cool, and it is mysterious and cool, and it's definitely one of the maybe the apotheosis of intellectual investigation in recent time, certainly from a physics domain, with consciousness, which also maybe shares some of these superlatives in terms of how curious and how mysterious it is, and how it's it's a character, very human and very sort of a high order thinking and things like that. But at the end of the day, I think we need to think very long and hard, how does quantum physics, as magnificent as it is, how does it sort of help us elucidate the other question? Because it's not always very clear to me, and sometimes I feel that juxtaposition is just by itself fascinating, and some people are enamored of this particular packaging, but it's not entirely clear how it one elucidates the other. And that's when I sort of defer to my peers and my colleagues and other experts to try to help me understand that. Jim.
Yeah, sure. So I guess from my perspective, I think on the one hand that obviously quantum physics is related to consciousness, but in a totally uninteresting way, and I think if you try to explore that on an interesting way, you have trouble seeing where there's space for the more interesting ways to get any ground. So I am what is sometimes called a physicalist, broadly understood. So I think that what we think of as mental states or states of consciousness are just some feature of underlying biological states, brain states, which in turn are composed of, brains are composed of cells, which are composed of molecules, which ultimately have an underlying physical description. And so, insofar as consciousness is then a biological phenomenon, there's a sense in which it's a physical phenomenon, and quantum physics is the best theory we've got for describing sort of the microstructure of physical phenomena. So this doesn't mean that I'm a reductionist in the sense that I think that we can somehow start with quantum theory of the constituents of the brain and come up with, sort of from first principles, even a theory of biological systems, never mind of consciousness. But I think that ultimately quantum physics is at the foundation for whatever the science of consciousness is going to be. And so from that point of view, if you're thinking about a few different things, one, whether or not, for instance, it makes sense to talk about consciousness causing something like the collapse of the wave function, as in there's some sort of special dynamics that appears in certain in interacting with certain kinds of physical systems because they're interacting with conscious systems. I would translate that into the claim that there are certain kinds of physical systems that, when interacting with other kinds of physical systems, lead to a kind of dynamics which is not quantum dynamics. Because after all, quantum dynamics is characterized by the unitary evolution of the wave function. And so you would want to think of the physical system, which happens to have this additional property of being conscious, interaction with whatever other physical system it's supposed to be collapsing the wave function of. And then that thing can be described quantum mechanically, and it's just going to evolve in the according to the unitary quantum dynamics. And so it seems to me that if you want to make the claim that consciousness is going to play some sort of causal role in our understanding of quantum physics, that what you mean by consciousness is sort of incompatible with physicalism, at least as I would understand it. So even if you want to say that it's something like integrated information theory, and I don't want to beat up on Kelvin here, but because I think in fact that is the thing that people talk about the most as a mathematical theory of consciousness, at least in the circles where I've heard anyone talk about such things. It seems to me as if you have to be thinking, look, there's a kind of physical system which can, because of the complexity of its dynamics or particular states that are available to it, already stops behaving like a quantum system. And I don't mean by that it it's sort of approximated by a semi-classical or fully classical description, but that in fact it doesn't admit of a quantum characterization at all. In which case, you've just moved the problem back a level, it seems to me. I'd like to understand the physics of those systems. And so, okay, so I guess really this is about whether this particular line of whether or not consciousness is going to play a role in quantum physics. And I guess though, although I think that maybe because all of us have some training in physics, we're starting with that question because it's got this long history. Maybe the question that we're supposed to be talking about is whether or not quantum physics is supposed to play a role in consciousness. Now, I guess I am very much sympathetic to concerns that have already been raised here about that. Which is basically, maybe let me say something sort of before getting into this. There's a basic difficulty along the line, if what we're interested in is finding some sort of experimental or testable or observational control over things collapsing the wave function, in particular things collapsing the wave function. Because the fact is, Andrew already mentioned decoherence. Decoherence mimics wave function collapse, and it occurs in all sorts of physical situations that we have no control over. And so being able to distinguish a situation where something, some external thing caused collapse as opposed to some external thing became correlated with various degrees of freedom in your system and in turn introduced environmental correlations of a sort that then prevented you from having coherence effects or superposition effects of a certain kind, seems to me to be essentially impossible. And in fact, I think any time that someone comes and says this kind of thing causes collapse, you're going to have a much more compelling story along the lines of this sort of thing induces environmental decoherence of a certain sort. Now, this is a problem because, from the point of view of foundations of quantum mechanics, because if you are not attracted to many worlds interpretations of quantum mechanics, perhaps you'd like it to be the case that there is some objective sense in which collapse sometimes happens. You're going to have a sort of general shielding problem where you're not really going to be able to tell, did collapse happen, or did something that simply simulates collapse because of these extra degrees of freedom coming from decoherence, or correlations with extra degrees of freedom that produce decoherence, has become important. But so I think where this leaves us is that there certainly is space for phenomena like transport phenomena that don't have an underlying classical foundation, that require quantum physics at some level to be important. But I think I think the ways in which that's true sort of rule out the kinds of mysterious quantum phenomena that probably are motivating people to think about quantum theory as playing some special role in consciousness in the first place. So I'll stop there.
I liked your comment about the fact that physicists are maybe more invested in quantum physics and then how consciousness is sort of able to illuminate quantum physics, whereas maybe I come from a place whereas consciousness is the main dish and quantum physics is maybe able to illuminate consciousness. And I think that's a very important differentiation, because I think that whether consciousness is the main dish or quantum physics is the main dish changes a little bit the way that we're even thinking about experiments and things of that nature. I think it's a very worthwhile point to give thought to a little bit, because I think that most psychologists, most people who are coming from the cognitive domain, and most people who are representing something having to do with psychiatry, behavioral neurology, neuropsychology, all these things, they are largely coming from the consciousness as the main dish school, and maybe perhaps quantum physics can do something to shed some more light insights or something that we don't understand about consciousness that we can actually suddenly understand much better with quantum physics. Whereas a lot of the people who are coming from quantum physics see it more as like a measurement thing, like maybe am I conscious of what I'm doing that actually changes the way that I'm doing. And I think that first of all there's a terminology or nomenclature kind of clash here at the first level. So that's one observation. Forgive me. The second observation that I want to make is that I think that most physicists are used to, and when they're talking about experiments, because most physicists are experimentalists if they're not super theoretical physicists who are completely removed from it, the kind of experiments that they do usually are only interacting with nature. They're not necessarily interacting with human nature. They're not necessarily interacting with psychology, with personalities, with things like that. So even if you're doing, quantum computation and you're concerned with the robustness or, error correction or things like that, these are, by and large, fairly structured domains where human nature and the complexity of human beings is not part of this thing. Whereas we are almost by definition, talking about human consciousness here. We're not talking about the consciousness of ants or the consciousness of molecules, or we are talking about human consciousness. That's what I'm talking about, at least, human consciousness. And human consciousness is extremely complex because it's a function of what I ate and what I'm thinking about and many other things. And for that, you don't need quantum physics. You just understand it as an organism. I mean, you understand that that's a very, complex kind of thing that colors your entire mood, and it's very tenuous, and it changes from, a second to second, and it's a function of how tired you are and how energetic you are, how inspired you are, and like all these things. So there's a clash here between a field that is in the exact sciences and is completely governed by the laws of nature, and a field that a lot of people would even poo-poo and dismiss as not being even scientific enough. And sometimes you would find it in the social sciences, and sometimes you would find it not even with the name science associated to it exactly, because it would be like human behavior or I don't know what. So that's the second clash that I see here. And that's not a clash of nomenclature, it's a clash of, I would say, paradigms. It's a clash of scientific thinking. It's a clash of what an experiment should produce or how it should come about. That's the second layer of clash that I see. And then the third layer that I see that I find a lot of times when I talk about this topic with people from different disciplines, I find that the idea of quantum mechanics rings very different to different ears in the following fashion. Some people deem quantum physics as some kind of a probabilistic approach to things. Usually these people don't have a very good understanding of quantum physics, but they think that quantum physics is a way to flip coins, or it's a way to do something like statistical physics. They sort of construe it through the lens of maybe a Boltzmann machine or statistical physics approach rather than quantum physics. That's one sort of approach that I have encountered. And then the other approach is something that sort of explains everything by saying, well, quantum physics accounts for everything that I'm doing and more. In other words, they don't have a good understanding of what quantum physics is, but they do know that everything that happens here is just described classically, but then there's another spice that is called quantum physics, and then when you sprinkle that on, that's going to explain a lot more. This approach I find more on the brain side, like on the psychology side and so on. They're not stupid people, they're very, very smart. They just don't necessarily have training in quantum physics. And then how do you get training in quantum physics when you're a busy individual in a different field? You read texts that are often popular, or they're often sort of, they give you the gist of things, and they don't, but you don't actually find yourself doing mathematical equations, or you don't study these things by living in the trenches for several years, like every physics major would probably do as part of the training. And the same is true for the other way around. So most quantum physicists that I know, most physicists actually, what they know about the brain is usually motivated and informed by very popular accounts of what they see on PBS or what they read on Scientific American, and then they put some kind of a physical spin on it. And I think that it's very difficult, just because of the sheer amount of investment that you have to put into these fields and how intellectually demanding they are. It's very difficult to find people who would be really well versed in quantum physics and really well versed in these topics of psychology, neuroscience, cognition, and so on, and put them together. So by definition, we're always getting people who are slightly more biased, or I would say slightly more top-heavy to one side. I don't think that that's necessarily a weakness. I mean, we can probably leverage it into a feature rather than a bug, but I think it's important to acknowledge in many ways. Kelvin, I'm interested in your opinion on what Jim said.
Sure. I think the dualism-physicalism debate is somewhat orthogonal to this, because if you want a physicalist version of the consciousness causes collapse hypothesis, it turns into the integrated information causes collapse hypothesis, and integrated information is physical. Although if you went the dualist route, you would have a partial solution to the problem that you mentioned, which is how do we get quantum mechanics to illuminate consciousness? If you think part of the problem initially is that we don't know what consciousness does, which is one way a lot of people formulate the hard problem of consciousness. This is an answer to what it does. It collapses the wave function. Now, I think you made quite a good point that, hey, if we develop this theory like this, aren't we sort of not really developing quantum mechanics because we need a whole physical theory for collapse? But usefully, a lot of this has already been worked out. because starting in the 1970s, you have the so-called dynamical collapse theory, starting with the GRW theory, developed by Girardi, Ramini, and Weber. You also have Philip Pearl's continuous spontaneous localization model. So these are physical theories which try to make sense of collapse. So they try and give a physical theory of exactly when and where collapse is happening. And then the idea behind integrated information causes collapse is it's just going to adopt the physical theory already worked out by those theories. So to put it very simply, if you look at the GRW interpretation of quantum mechanics, which most people working in foundations of quantum mechanics think is at least rigorous, there's issues trying to get a relativistic formulation going, but that's true of many interpretations of quantum mechanics, Bohmian mechanics and so forth. I mean, they associate every particle with a probability per unit time for spontaneous collapse, such that when it's very low, and then such that when they'll get entangled, the probability gets really high. And so it's kind of like size causes collapse in that theory. The larger a system is, more specifically, the larger the number of entangled particles that compose it, the faster the rate of its spontaneous collapse to the position basis. Okay, so one way of mathematically formulating the consciousness causes collapse hypothesis, or the integrated information causes collapse hypothesis, would be in the way that Kobe Kremneuser and Andre Ranchin, who are mathematicians at Oxford, did, which is to just replace size with integrated information. So the more integrated information, the higher probability per unit time the system will collapse into the position basis. So I think a lot of the mathematics is there for spelling out the collapse physics. What you can do is you can adopt the existing literature on dynamical collapse theories.
Right, so it's not quantum physics though, it's a different theory, which is fine. I mean, it may be that what we're doing here is coming to understand that either because of what we're coming to understand is that in order to solve the conceptual problems, the foundations of quantum mechanics, we need to give up quantum mechanics and adopt a theory which is empirically equivalent to it in certain domains, but which disagrees with it in terms of what the actual dynamics governing the evolution of a wave function is. I think it's it seems to me that you're not doing a whole lot for consciousness, I mean for our understanding of consciousness, to say that we're going to change quantum, like we're going to use a theory of consciousness to try to solve problems in quantum mechanics. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that it's going the other direction. It's taking integrated information theory and saying here's a physical criterion. But I don't think anything that you just said is incompatible with the perspective I was adopting, because I said, well, what you need to do is understand how some physical systems and interacting with other physical systems behave dynamically in a way that's incompatible with the Schrodinger equation. And in fact, that's exactly what GRW and Pearl's continuous collapse theory do.
Do you find, all of you, do you find, for example, actually, before we go there, something that, Jim, you can weigh in on from a historical perspective. I mean, you have an interest in von Neumann, you're writing, or you're in the process of writing a book about. He had quite a bit of interest in quantum physics towards the end of his career, and quantum computation and things of that nature. Do you think at all that some of this discussion would be appealing to him at his time?
So, von Neumann did most of his work in quantum mechanics actually very early in his career.
I thought it was fairly late.
No, so he, it was in 1926, 1927 that he was first introduced to quantum theory. He went to visit David Hilbert in Göttingen, just as other people in Göttingen, like Heisenberg and Jordan, were just working out quantum mechanics for the first time. And he realized that there were some mathematical difficulties. In fact, other mathematicians who were in Göttingen already recognized this and thought that the new theory was incoherent. And von Neumann's big part of his major contributions to quantum mechanics were all in a series of papers in 1927 and 1929 that then came out in a book in 1932 called The Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. He continued working on issues in quantum mechanics in the 1930s, but after 1937 had really moved on to other projects. But much later in his career, beginning around 1944, he started working on computation and played a major role in the design, in the trenches engineering problems, and ultimately building a first class of stored program computers. And in fact, any computer you've ever used is based on something called the von Neumann architecture, which he developed. Now, at the end of his career, literally on his deathbed, he was preparing lecture notes that would eventually be published posthumously as a book called The Computer and the Brain, where he explores the relationship between the then still very new theory and also practice of computing with various ideas about brains and cognition and consciousness. Along the way, he got interested. He developed a theory of cellular automata. He developed he did lots of early work on neural nets, mathematical work on neural nets, all of which was sort of motivated by this interest of the relationship between computers and brains. Now, I would say that in fact it is striking how little quantum mechanics enters into this, given that he is extremely well known for quantum mechanics and for work on computation, and wrote this book on computation and the brain. It's not that he doesn't say anything, but it's really not the focus, I would say. Now, that doesn't mean that he wouldn't be interested in the issues. In fact, he was the person who first formulated the measurement problem in anything like the modern understanding of it. It was exactly the problem that we've all been talking about. Eugene Wigner, who made the suggestion that consciousness causes collapse, Wigner was a year ahead of him at Gymnasium in Budapest. They were friends from when they were 12 years old on. In fact, Wigner joined him on his honeymoon in January of 1930. The three of them sailed to Princeton together. Von Neumann, his wife, and Wigner. And certainly this was these ideas were ones that von Neumann was very much aware of. But didn't comment on later in his life. So his comments on it were really in the context of the 1932 book, where he suggests, well, it could be consciousness that causes collapse.
The computer in the brain, you mean?
No. In the 1932 book, Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. So his big idea there is, look, there's these two dynamics. We don't know when one applies and when the other applies. We know that at some point, in order to get measurement results of a sort that we recognize, these characteristically statistical or probabilistic predictions that quantum mechanics makes, we need to stop applying the unitary dynamics and start applying this other dynamics. But part of his argument is that it doesn't matter where you do it. This is called the von Neumann Cut Argument. There are different places. It could be that it's just when the observer brain or the observer's consciousness becomes involved that this collapse happens. But it could also be much earlier in the process, where the measuring instrument begins to interact with the system that's being measured, and that's where collapse happens, and it's all a classical description from there. And so one of the things he's at pains to show in the 1932 book is that you actually can't tell the difference between these cases.
In principle or just practically?
So I think, so he's aware of what's known as Wigner friend type situations, right? So the possibility that, so the Wigner's friend scenario is one where you have some physical system and a scientist who's making a measurement on it. The system is in some superposition. When the scientist makes the measurement, it collapses into one of, say, two possible outcomes. You say, okay, well, did the person, the scientist's consciousness collapse the wave function? Here's a way to test it. It's very simple. We take the scientist and the system they're studying, isolate them, maybe supercool them if necessary. And now we try to do an interference experiment of some sort. We find some observable. We say, can we treat this as a quantum system, and try to find an experiment that we can do. And in principle, these always exist, such that we can tell whether or not the system, when the scientist inside the box makes the measurement, whether that collapse has actually happened, or if what has happened is merely that the scientist has now evolved into some superposition of having measured one outcome and having measured the other outcome. And so this sort of argument shows that, of course, there is an in-principle difference between the case where, in principle even measurable difference between the case where the consciousness has actually collapsed the wave function and the situation where consciousness doesn't collapse the wave function. But you might also think there is also an in-principle observational reason, like an in-principle, in-practice reason why you couldn't actually detect that because of the character of environmental decoherence and the way in which complex systems behave quantum mechanically. So I think the right way of answering the question is to say it's in practice, but the in practice argument is very difficult to skirt except in sort of fanciful thought experiments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess there is this whole sort of experimental paradigm surrounding the dynamical collapse theories like GRW, Philip Pearl's CSL, and so forth, and they're trying to at least place just boundaries on where the sort of parameters of the theory that define the speed of the collapse and how often it should be given the number of particles and so forth. There's another interesting phenomena, though, that most of these theories violate energy conservation. So the collapse of the wave function will violate energy conservation, and that in itself has sort of led to another experimental paradigm where you try to look for spontaneous heating, spontaneous sound emission in certain systems. I mean, some of the one of these theories that tells us that just molecules will collapse given enough time. And there's some experiments. There's a cave in Germany where the temperature variation it almost never varies, and so they're looking for spontaneous fluctuations in temperature in places in the cave just to try and test this theory. So yeah, very, very difficult, but people are working, physicists are working on how to test collapse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'd like to change the conversation slightly in terms of direction. And actually, I'm happy that, Andrew, you know Matthew Fisher from before, and you have your product of UCSB and all that. When a physicist of some repute is putting forward a theory or an idea, saying that here is a particular argument for why quantum physics actually plays a role in the brain, I'm sure that the quantum physics community is a little bit outraged by this. I mean, it just sounds to me like the right thing to do as a conservative community of scientists. But then it feels to me, at least by observing it from outside, that it's actually fairly well received. Or there's not an earthquake, and he hasn't been shunned, and the whole thing seems quite reasonable.
Yes, so Matthew Fisher is a very well-respected condensed matter theorist. I was a student of his in my student days there, and I know him fairly well. And certainly he has a very good body of work in theoretical condensed matter physics. And so he has this new proposal about how quantum physics could play some role in the brain. And I guess it depends a little bit on who you talk to, right? So as you mentioned, some people that are more conservative about it would just say it's all nonsense, right? But I guess I come back to the point of this whole conversation in the first place, which is we're trying to explore if the question has any meaning at all. Does it? If we're going to say quantum mechanics has some role to play in the brain, if we want to pose that as a scientific question, we have to at least propose some models or propose some theories, and then the scientific process, the whole point of the scientific process is to take those ideas and theories and see to what extent they are verified in laboratory experiments. So in the sense that he has a concrete proposal, I think in that forward is a step forward. It's a scientific proposal that can be either shot down or possibly verified. And so that's a well-posed scientific question. And so I think from that point of view, it's perfectly fine. Now, granted, I think any kind of scientific progress we're going to make in this or any other area often will involve ideas that may be considered outside of the mainstream. And if I think back on the history of science, many of the ideas that are now accepted without any blush were considered completely beyond the pale at the time, right? There are countless examples of that. So I'm sure going forward there will be ideas that are raised that people would dismiss as complete nonsense that have to be explored, and eventually, if history is our guide, will found to be true. So we shouldn't, just because an idea sounds strange or new, doesn't mean we should dismiss it, right? And so I think any kind of, look, this is a hard problem we're talking about here, right? So from my understanding, any kind of attempt to understand consciousness, it's the hard problem of consciousness, the kind that we were talking about with Kelvin earlier, the kind of that talks about the sense of qualia. And so I don't think we can, we can take those ideas, right, or those experiences and reduce them down to a mechanistic understanding. I mean, the fact is that we as human beings, we're coming up with these ideas all the time. We're having new thoughts. We're having new expressions. We can't reduce that to some kind of underlying deterministic or even stochastic behavior. Something is going on there that's qualitatively new, right? And so any kind of, okay, let me put it this way. When we do science, what is the job of science? The job of science is to try to understand, or at least, if not understand, at least to describe. It's to describe some periodicities or regularities in nature. Right? If we do something, then the consequence X happens every time. Or if we can't predict something X happens every time, at least we could say some fraction of the time such and such happens. Right? But with something like consciousness, it's a creative process. It's something that's happening new every time, all the time. It's something we can't reduce to a deterministic process, or I would claim even a stochastic process. So any kind of explanation for that, I think, has to go beyond that kind of explanatory mechanism, right? So to the effect, to the point that can quantum mechanics play some role? I don't know. I think we can pose scientific questions about it. But again, we're trying to explain something that is not regular, something that is not, can't be described in a predictive, I can't predict what you're going to do this afternoon, right? Even if I observe you for 100 years, you could surprise me, right? And so I think, so one question we might even begin with is, can consciousness admit a scientific understanding? Right? That I think is maybe the more fundamental question, even before we get to does quantum mechanics have something
But I
to do
think
with
that most behavioral scientists, certainly in departments of psychology, will be able to tell you that they can actually predict with pretty good accuracy many patterns of behavior that people will do without quantum physics.
without any kind of physics, right? Just by observing patterns, right? But all right, so the fact, if I sit down tomorrow and I write a new paper discovering some new effect that no one has ever discovered before, I can't trace that back to something else, right? That's something that's some fundamentally new idea that no one's ever had before that I can't predict because there's no prior anything to go on, right? Anyway, so I don't know if this is getting off a sidetrack, but I would say, from my point of view, I would raise that, can we have any kind of, if we look at the kind of scientific theories we have, we look at classical Newtonian physics, we look at electricity and magnetism, we look at statistical physics even, those are all able to describe regularities and patterns, starting with some certain set of conceptual framework and being able to go forward with that, because precisely they're regularities, right? And so trying to apply that same methodology to people, right, to our own thoughts, which may have some degree of predictability, but I would argue it can't be subjected to the same kind of scientific or scientific furniture, simply because it's in a different class.
Do you agree with that?
I think it's really important to make a distinction between consciousness and free will. So you've got our conscious experiences, there's something it's like to see blue or to feel pain, and then on the other hand there's our free choices, our choices about what to do. And I think it is worth keeping these separate a little bit. I mean, both are very interesting topics, and we can talk about connections between quantum mechanics and both. But if we're just talking about conscious experiences, which is I think where I was thinking we were sort of mostly concentrating, I mean, there you can kind of get a science going for that, right? Because I can look for neural correlates of consciousness. I can get you to report on what you're experiencing. I can look at what's happening in your brain as you report and start drawing up correlations. And if I get enough correlations, I can maybe build a theory, or even if I don't get to a theory, I can at least start predicting what your next experience is going to be. So there's just states of experience characterized in terms of what it is like to have them. But then there's also this other issue of free choice, which is another very thorny philosophical topic. How can I choose what I want to do of my own free will if I'm just this physical system that is entirely deterministic, such that what I actually do is determined by factors beyond my control, the laws of nature and the initial conditions of the universe? Yeah, that's a whole other puzzle. I don't know how far we want to
We will
go
talk
into
about
that.
it a little
Yeah.
bit, but I want Jim to speak a little bit more because he has to run out soon. So, Jim, if I were to press you, well, if I was to press you, because I'm going to press you. So if I was to press you and say, you know, in your, like, without thinking about it too much, what would be like really interesting things where you would think that, you know, looking at consciousness as things that are related to consciousness and quantum physics, things that are related to quantum physics, to put them together, where would those surface? I mean, what kind of thing would be interesting for you as a scholar, as a thinker, to see them?
Yeah, so maybe this is partially an answer to that question, but reacting a little bit to what Andrew was just saying, I'm not sure that I see clear evidence for an in-principle distinction between, for instance, you know, weather prediction, or
I mean, prediction of the weather.
Prediction of the weather, yeah. So, and prediction of either human qualitative experience or human behavior. So, a lot depends on how finely grained you take the things you're trying to predict to be, right? I mean, so we can't predict the rain reliably 15 days out. We can predict it pretty reliably a couple days out. You're not going to be able to tell me where particular raindrops are going to fall, right? And so I think there's a kind of prediction. No, I cannot predict what paper you're going to go home and write. But there are much weaker things that you might try to predict that, you know, along the lines of what Kelvin's describing, that I think you might be able to predict, and which are compatible with the whole system being governed by a deterministic, albeit highly complex and open, like driven by various outside factors, system. So I guess what I would want to understand, I mean, using this as a sort of a metaphor, if you're doing, say, climate science, or you're doing galactic evolution or something like this, where you have highly complicated systems where physics on many different scales and many different sorts are important, one way you might try to answer the question, does such and such kind of physics, matter, is to try to simulate the particular kinds of phenomena that we're looking for using our best theoretical understanding without that physics, and see how hard it is to reproduce the phenomena. And so if you're interested in the question of whether or not magnetic fields matter to galactic evolution, well, observe that if you don't include magnetic fields, you just don't get galaxies to evolve the way that we seem to see them evolve. If you're interested in whether or not sunlight is important for cloud formation, or whether or not particular environmental pollutants are going to make a difference to cloud formation, see if you can simulate cloud formation without those factors, and then see what happens when you include them. Of course, we're nowhere near that point with consciousness now, and there remain very difficult issues related to qualia, related to distinguishing a situation where something that you're simulating or something that you've built responds in certain ways, like saying, yes, I experience red, versus actually having the experience, right? And this is something I don't think we have any idea how to operationalize in the third person.
I actually like very much what you said about the weather, because to me, that's a very telling example, and it speaks directly to the point that you raised. So if you look how we were able to predict weather and weather forecast, let's say 50 years ago, compared to where we are today, I think that people were largely laughing at the recommendation of a weather forecaster, and whether to take an umbrella or something like that. It was sort of a recommendation, but very loose one. And I think today, very few people would ignore a forecast person telling them, oh, there's going to be a storm coming in, or you need to do this and that, just because the ability of the science to predict if it's 3 or 4 or 5 days in, or 18 hours in, or something, has such a direct impact on our lives that we've been conditioned to appreciate that this is important. Perhaps we can do sort of the same thing in the realm of consciousness without presuming to understand it very well, but being able to say something like about what you are likely to feel or think or compute over a short period of time, or with a certain granularity that is very coarse. And I think that's what you're basically trying to say. And I think that's a very important point, because we're not talking here about some kind of a comprehensive understanding that would solve everything. I'm talking about like baby steps that would just take it. And I think the weather analogy is a very good one. I was about to use it myself, as a matter of fact. So I'm glad that you brought it up. But how do you, as a physicist, how do you respond to that?
No, I think Kelvin's point was also well taken, which is that if you say, I'm just going to try to have correlations, right? So correlations is something scientists understand very well. I put a red apple in front of me, and I see a part of my brain light up. I can correlate that. So that's a pattern that I can quantify as a scientist, right? That's something that we can do. So I guess what I was talking about before was more along this, what Chalmers would call the hard problem of consciousness. Can I associate the concept of redness with some kind of functional thing or physical thing? And that was what I was more speaking to. But I think certainly being able to make some kind of predictions, or at least some kind of associations, is certainly something that is certainly in the role of science to be able to do. And it may be that quantum physics has some role to play there.
What do you think that role would be? How can you, like, if I pressed you about it, like, where would you see it emerging?
Yes. So we mentioned before. So if it's true, and indeed, so if we associate chemistry with brain function or consciousness, and we say, depending on the kinds of chemistry that's in my bloodstream, right? So you mentioned lithium, for example, as one, or if I have certain kind of minerals, it seems to have some effect on our brain function, right? So that's again a correlation between matter and some reporting of a patient, right? So being able to then to be able to say, what's the physical process going on? Is this particular atom or ion penetrating a blood-brain barrier more effectively or not? That's a biophysical process you can characterize and evaluate, right? And so those are the kinds of questions that I see that we'd be able to have some kind of scientific progress towards understanding that, right? And so, if, for example, the fact that lithium 4 versus lithium 5 having the same chemical reactions but having a different mass has some different effect, right? If that could be a kind of thing to investigate, right? So maybe there is a role that, for example, quantum tunneling might have to play, or some other features. From my own reading about these other ideas about coherence in the microtubules, or these other kinds of ideas about quantum computing going on as a source of brain function, it seems unlikely to me that that's going on, but I'm open-minded for all these things. If people can give me good reasons to reconsider that, it could be that nature knows how to do quantum computing much better than we do,
well,
right? So these are things that we could look at. So this reminds me of something else I wanted to say. Speaking about quantum mechanics and biology more generally, is that people are very interested in thinking more about, is there a role, maybe not quantum mechanics plays in consciousness, but what role does quantum mechanics play in biology more generally? So people have been interested in the past few years in looking at the role of photosynthesis, for example. And the way that people have proposed quantum mechanics plays a role in those kind of systems is not that they have long-lived quantum coherence. It's that they see that basically quantum processes are happening, but on a very, very, very short time scale. So these are like femtosecond time scale, something like that. And if you do experiments, they're able to capture it on these very short time scales. There is a kind of a chemical process where you have an ion that's being exchanged. You have in that chemical process seems to have some kind of a quantum coherent oscillations associated with that. So that could be another kind of example where quantum coherence has some role to play, but just on a very, very short time scale, even on room temperature scale. So that's something else you could look into as a possible avenue.
Jim, I had another question for you. Let's say that you had a dear one who had bipolar disorder. And I came with this proposal, I or other people came with this proposal of, hey, we're doing this study where we're giving lithium 6, lithium 7. It's the same to you, it shouldn't make a difference, it's the same lithium, but one is different from the other and at the quantum level, and we have reason to think that one of them is going to be better than the other, let's say. Do you think that as a patient you should care philosophically? Do you think that there's an ethical issue here? Do you think that we should be concerned about these things? Is there something that we're missing? Because from my perspective, I feel that should be immaterial to the patients. However, any kind of IRB would say we have zero information about what this drug does, and we have a lot of information about what this drug does. Therefore, you need to go through an 8-year process of experimenting on mice and zebras and zebrafish and like all these things before you can even do something like that. And my argument would be, but you are potentially depriving these people of 8 years of effective medication, where the difference between the two drugs is at the quantum level. So why not just shortcut the whole process and just give it to them, because we know exactly what's happening with lithium anyway. And lithium is one of the simplest atoms in the periodic table.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of internal tension in the position, right? Because it can't both be the case that you don't expect there to be any difference at all, and it's an interesting experiment that's worth doing. If the argument is, look, right now, people are getting just a mix of these lithium isotopes. Sure, one tends to be more prevalent in nature than the other, but we're not doing anything to try to purify it or something like that. And if you actually have reason to think one of them is going to be better than what people are getting now, I would think that there would be a quite strong argument to make that that's no worse than any other situation where you're doing clinical trials, right? I mean, so it's always the case that you have to do these human trials in order to try to evaluate whether or not the hypothesis is right. And of
By the way,
course, there
just
are
to be
risks
clear
associated
and
with it.
fair, everybody's getting only one type of lithium so far, which is like 96% abundant on Earth.
Is that not? So it's not the. So people
It's not a
actually
mixture. It's not a
are
mixture.
removing.
Everybody's getting one type of lithium,
I
and
see.
we will have
Okay.
to create the other one to give it to them, like in an artificial way, or almost, or we'll have to
I
work
see.
hard to get it. So it's not the case that they're getting some kind of a mixture, and we can.
I see. Okay. Well, then I misunderstood the situation. Yeah. I guess my view then would be that it really depends on why we think giving the other kind of lithium is something worth pursuing.
And do you think a quantum physics argument would hold water?
A quantum physics argument that
Would favor-
there should be no difference,
There-
or
there
that
is a
one of them
difference.
is going to.
Yeah.
Simply that one is more massive than the other. Right.
That because of quantum tunneling, for example, one is going to give you more, effect, and your relief, your symptomatic relief is going to be much bigger, much better.
But is it because of tunneling? Is it the less massive one that is going to be more?
Let's say.
That would be the hypothesis.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the more massive one that's currently being administered. Yeah, I mean, it's true that we have pretty good theoretical control over the role that mass is going to play in tunneling rates, and so if quantum effects make a difference at all, I mean, if quantum tunneling is part of how this is getting into cells and is part of how it's efficacious, then I would think that that would be pretty prima facie strong reason to think that the less massive one would be.
Because you'd be surprised, but organizations like the FDA and they couldn't care less about quantum physics. I mean, to them that's not even on the spectrum of being considered for anything. They would need to see some kind of a clinical argument that is based on the physiology that is taught in med school. And since quantum physics is not taught in med school and is not part of what you see in a medical school environment, and these clinical trials are by definition sort of the purview of the argument actually sounds like you're making a statement in Chinese to people who are not speaking Chinese. So they don't even understand what you're saying, in a way.
Saying that you have theoretical reasons to think that uptake of this molecule or of this atom is going to be.
And then the whole argument comes around again to trying to take a quantum physics argument and to try to convince people that there's actually clinical merit to trying this. You understand? Which is actually quite difficult if you think about it. But it's not difficult for the reasons that we think. It's not difficult scientifically. It's difficult bureaucratically, which is another layer that we didn't talk about at all. Because quantum physics is so removed from the world of IRBs and patient rights and these things that it's considered like something that is a theoretical abstraction that does not have any direct application to individuals. So even if you try to make that, it's very difficult to convince the system to even listen to you. But that's another aspect altogether.
But quantum mechanics is providing the chemistry for you in the first place, right?
Correct.
Chemistry exists because of the quantum physics. So.
But the arguments that you usually put are not quantum physics arguments. That happens in a different department and in a different world. I mean, bureaucratically, most of these people have no idea, what this thing means even. So that's one point. And then the last point that I wanted to make is, would there be some kind of a golden experiment? So, for example, sometimes I ask, when I speak about evolution, let's say, and I have people who are creationists, and I say to them, what kind of evidence can I show you that would allow you to sort of snap out of your belief? I mean, what would be a golden piece of information? And I say the same thing to the evolution. Like, what kind of evidence would a creationist show you where you'll have to say, I have to rethink it now. Now that you said this, I have to. So it's very easy, for example, for somebody who believes in evolution to say, oh, if you showed me, very strong evidence that, a human being and a dinosaur, coexisted at the same time. That would really throw me for a loop. If you say it to a creationist, they basically say, well, there's nothing, there's nothing. I know that I'm right, and there's nothing you can say. So I'd like to take the evolutionary kind of, the evolutionist approach and say, what kind of an experiment would you need to say to each one of you? What kind of an experiment would you need to see, or would you like to see, in order to be able to say, that would really make me happy, or that would really make me convinced, or would provide compelling evidence for me personally, with my philosophy, with my background, with my disposition, and so on, constitution, that there's actually some kind of a crosstalk between quantum physics and brain activity. What would that be?
I mean, if we're actually talking about quantum physics and brain activity,
or consciousness specifically,
I would be satisfied with experiments involving so for instance, what you might think of as quantum assisted transport in a single cell. So if you can make the case that the rate at which this particular atom or molecule or chemical substance passes through the cellular membrane requires a quantum mechanical explanation. It would seem to me that has already done it. That's already shown that quantum mechanics is
at the level of a single cell.
Yeah, essential to brain activity. Yeah, because then we know that in fact in your actual, in your brain, it's very likely that the way in which your neurons say are communicating with their ambient substrate.
Kelvin, would that be sufficient for you?
Yes. I'm not sure. Is that really the case? I mean, if you look at the way neurons reach their action potential, I mean, there's these channels that open up and close that let in potassium ions, and I mean, there's really evidence that actually this is a quantum mechanical process.
I know. I'm saying if there were.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
That would suffice for me.
Unless those quantum mechanical effects are somehow sort of averaged out, so that at the level of neural behavior, just firing behavior, like a neural net, it's sort of the quantum mechanics kind of washes out a little bit, and that can be described purely classically. So it might be that underlying quantum effects could be averaged out somehow, so that at the larger scale, the scale of collections of neurons, you've got purely classical phenomena. Do you know what I mean?
It depends on what we mean by brain activity then.
Yeah, because there is this issue with consciousness with scale.
Right.
Like, why is consciousness associated with a given scale? We seem to associate it with the scale of neurons or groups of neurons, not with the scale of entire brains talking to each other. There's no one consciousness associated with that. There seems to be one consciousness associated at the scale of interacting neurons, and also not at the lower scale of just the molecules inside a neuron, setting aside the microtubule stuff. So that's a puzzle, but it seems like, at least the mainstream view, the scale at which consciousness occurs is at the scale of neurons. And so you could have quantum mechanical effects inside a given neuron, how ions are sort of going in and out in a given neuron. For me, it would depend as to whether that percolates up into the neural network.
Yeah, but so I mean, I'm answering Amir's question of brain activity.
Yeah.
So I think that one would then want to ask two further questions. One, how does sort of base level brain activity actually produce consciousness? And two, are the quantum effects at the level of single cell phenomena relevant to that?
Right. Yep. Andrew, do you have any?
Yeah. So again, I would go back and say, what kind of quantum effects are we talking about? Because on the basic level, I mean, almost all these things we're talking about can have a quantum description. I mean, quantum originated as a theory of atoms, right? So the fact you have atoms, the fact you have ions that are involved, these are all in some sense on a very basic level, these are all quantum effects we're talking about, right? And so I think what we need to be very precise, what kind of quantum effects you want to see. What would you be satisfied with? We talked about in a single ion transporting across the barrier. That is a quantum effect. But you could say, okay, what do I want to see? If I wanted to see some kind of coherence, right? Or if I wanted to see tunneling, something like that, then I think I would like to see something a little bit more than we've talked about already. So I would like to see something something more dramatic, let's say, right?
What?
So if you could show me, for example, some of these Penrose microtubule things are actually working. If I dig into the brain, I do very precise experiments in vivo on cells doing their thing and showing that if I measure them in particular ways, they behave in the way that quantum mechanics describes for me, that's in accordance with the quantum mechanical formalism, then I'd say, that'll do it, right? I'm a believer, right, so to speak, right? But that's also a tall order, right? And so I think that would be the more dramatic form of the kind of experiment or evidence you're looking for.
You see, to me, I have to say, the evidence would be, and I'm not saying it's black and white, but the evidence to me would be if I can demonstrate, for example, with lithium-6,7, let's say if we use that paradigm, that I can get more out of one than the other, to me that's enough.
Mm-hmm. But let me give a counter argument. What if you came to me with this data and you showed that indeed that these two isotopically different samples had different effects? And I could come to you and I could give you a classical model of having one atom weigh more than the other atom, that would have, I could, because of the inertia of those two atoms being different, I could give you a Newtonian argument showing that if because this is so much heavier, it just simply penetrates that, it has more momentum, something like this. I could come up with a classical explanation. So I don't see just showing that the isotope X does better than isotope Y necessarily demands a quantum mechanical explanation.
All right, so I guess this is my personal shortcoming with quantum physics then, because I thought, or I'm under the impression that just by definition, these two should operate exactly the same on the classical level.
No, the chemistry should be the same because it has the same number of electrons, right, and the same number of protons.
Right.
So that means the chemistry is the same, but it has different masses, right? Because they have different masses, they have an extra neutron between the two of them. And because they have a different mass, if I wanted to adopt a classical particle point of view and describe some classical particles, I would see that this particle X has a different mass than particle Y, and so therefore, F is equal to ma, blah, 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 and so I may be able to come up with some classical physics explanation on those grounds.
So is that something that needs to happen before I do the experiment? In other words, do I need to exhaust this possibility before and say, even before I do this experiment, is there like across the house, agreement that if this happens, it's going to be quantum? Because people can always do that after the fact.
Yes. I would say so, that you should have very good reasons for ruling out other explanations. If this is your smoking gun experiment, you need to make yourself bulletproof for people coming along and say, no, this was just some classical physics expect that I can explain on the back of this envelope.
Yeah.
So the nice thing about an experiment like this is that even if it gets shut down on this grounds, and if it helps, if it has clinical help, it was still worthwhile doing.
Absolutely.
So that's the only win-win situation here. So if we are able to help patients and do a better thing, great, and people would still want to fund it. If we want to advance quantum physics and understanding of tunneling effects in the brain and so on, that's another thing. But I have a feeling that no matter what I'm going to do, somebody, might be you, it might be Jim, it might be somebody else, say, that's very cute, but I think that there's a good classical explanation for this. And I don't know how I can get around this. I mean, I just don't know philosophically. I don't know how I can get around this, because somebody can always come again and give me a...
I have to go, but let me make a comment on this. It seems to me as if just the logic of experiment is that you start with the hypothesis, you have a reason for doing the experiment, and then, you do the experiment, you see what the results are, you see whether or not they're compatible with the hypothesis that you came up with. Now, of course, it's true that people can come up and identify competing hypotheses, but often the way this process works is that they're competitors for particular reasons, and now you come up with a new hypothesis that's going to distinguish, or a new experiment that's going to distinguish this particular hypothesis from this alternative which arguably could explain the results that you got in the first place. But it's a kind of winnowing down of possibilities. And so I don't think it needs to be the case that you, before doing an experiment, you first need to show that this experiment, were it to be successful, would definitively show this result and no other possibility, right? It's sufficient to say this experiment which would provide evidence. I mean, so this experiment would show, for instance, that lithium-6 has effects that lithium-7 doesn't. So that's already evidence for something about the difference between lithium-6 and lithium-7 being causally efficacious in this particular brain process. Now, you think it's because of the quantum mechanical effects? That seems like a compelling thing. If someone can come up with a story that's something about the way diffusion is going to work with the differences in mass, or something about the way cellular membranes work for letting things of different mass in and out, that narrows the focus a bit. And now we have to ask, well, what are some things that couldn't explain that the quantum mechanical hypothesis would explain, and do another experiment. And so I don't think that no experiment shows definitively once and for all, it's this theory and no other possibility.
Clearly, and that's why I wanted you to come up with an experiment, and then, just from a quick discussion, you can see already that at the single neuron level, maybe it's not enough, and maybe we need to do it at a network level or something like that, because some people would say, oh, when you scale it, and when you put enough thing, actually the quantum effect disappears, and it's endless, right? I mean, you always have more and more and more and more things. But I guess what I'm trying to point at is that it's very difficult to find the ultimate experiment.
Yeah, but I think that's true
of anything.
Experimental science.
Yeah.
So maybe one thing that...
Go ahead and run. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jim, for coming here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll put you in in touch with the final product that we're going to have from this, and we can discuss them further.
Okay.
Nice meeting you.
Hello to your wife, and you have a magic show coming whenever you want. Okay. All right.
Perhaps just briefly, I was just going to say one thing that I feel like does need to happen here is. The onus isn't to just rule out every conceivable way of how you could alternatively explain this, but if there is a sort of a way already of explaining it that works in other cases, that would need to be ruled out for this particular case. And I guess I have in mind, maybe Daniele made this suggestion, that we do have cases where you just change the isotope and it has a massive biological difference. So drinking water, if you change protein, the usual hydrogen isotope into deuterium, it's just a change in isotope, but you die. And so one thing, why does that happen? I mean, maybe that's quantum mechanical, but how do we even know that that is poisonous? I take it that is well known that it's poisonous. I haven't looked into what the explanation is, but one would wonder, would some people dismiss this by saying, well, we've got an explanation in the water case already, and probably that same kind of thing is probably going on here in this case.
Isn't it just because it's radioactive, right? It's heavy water.
Is it?
Isn't it?
Oh, okay. Well,
it is heavy water.
Okay. I didn't know that was why it was poisonous, but...
Yeah, like if you drink radium or something,
yeah.
right?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Okay, so that's an example where here's a case where just changing the isotope does lead to biological differences when you consume it. And I was worried if there are existing cases where you already have a classical explanation, do you have a reason to say that's not what's going on here? And it looks like, well, okay, in the case of water you do. What about all the other cases? Are there other cases where we already know of where you change the isotope, you have a biological difference when you consume it? If you can say those classical explanations don't work here, that to me would be enough. I feel like you could get an argument for it's worth pursuing the quantum explanation.
By the way, do you find, Andrew, that it's more of a quantum physics pursuit here, or it's more of a quantum chemistry pursuit? Like when we start talking about these kind of things, do you find like it's more the domain of a quantum chemist than of a quantum physicist?
Yeah, it's a good question. So usually the quantum chemists are concerned with large molecules and trying to describe their configurations and how they have reactions and things like that. So that would be more of their domain. So in that sense, I think that could well be true. You know, if we're trying to identify some particular molecule that has a quantum signature, it could be a quantum chemist is a better person to talk to. But on the other hand, if your explanation is some kind of tunneling process, then I would say ordinary quantum physicists would be probably more more insightful.
What is your take on quantum computation, and do you think that quantum computation is a good model, maybe, to think about analogies with the human brain?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So the idea is that so often people don't understand quantum computation. What is it, very clearly? And let me just quickly say a few words about that, which is that there are certain types of algorithms that have been identified in a computer science sense that if you run them on a regular computer using a Turing machine versus you run them on a quantum computer, you can get some kind of speed up in how quickly you execute those algorithms. All right, and so as far as we know, there are only really a handful of algorithms where quantum computers would give you an advantage. So one example is factoring numbers, where you have an exponential advantage in terms of the time or resources it takes to execute that task. But we've only identified really a handful, and that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of them. But if we're trying to use quantum computation as the silver bullet to explain why does quantum consciousness, so why does my brain seem to have qualitatively different kinds of abilities than a classical computer, I don't think we're barking up the right tree there. Because the kinds of problems, so quantum computers, they still have the same kind of class of problems that they're interested in as classical computers. You mentioned before when you were talking about consciousness, you mentioned the word computation, and I thought that was interesting because when I think of consciousness, that's not the word that comes to my mind. My mind goes to things like experience or feeling or intuition or things like that. Whereas when I think about things like computation or like playing a game of chess or something like that, I don't think, I guess it is consciousness, but I think of it more like in a different part of my brain almost. It's sort of an intuition. But I would say quantum computation, unless we're able to discover whole new classes of algorithms that can be done more quickly, I would say it seems to me that that's not the right kind of explanation you need to explain human consciousness, why it seems to be qualitatively different than normal kinds of computation.
Do you also, Kelvin, have this notion that the word computation does not quite capture this thing? Because to me, consciousness is a form of computation. It's a form of neural computation.
Yeah. So it's for the reasons we're talking about with a hard problem, it's hard to pin down a sort of a functional definition of consciousness, but at the very least I'm happy about thinking of the physical substrate of consciousness or the neural correlates of consciousness in terms of computations or algorithms, so I'm happy with that kind of description. And I guess I agree with what you said about, I'm not sure what could be gained by talking about those algorithms in terms of quantum algorithms rather than classical algorithms or anything like that. The only connection I see there is harking back to this consciousness causes collapse theory. A way of testing it, if you're combining it with integrated information theory, would be with quantum computers, and then you're seeing what kinds of classical algorithms you could put into superposition, because it's predicting that there's going to be some that you can't. But other than that, I don't see an immediate connection with quantum computation. I mean, there's the Stuart Hameroff stuff. What's going on in the microtubules is quantum computations, and that's what generates consciousness. That's the other connection.
Yeah, but I guess that would be, of course, a spectacular finding. But I'm just very skeptical that that's what's.
Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges I think it was Max Tegmark gave to Stuart in a conference was, if you've really discovered this, why wouldn't the computer science community be all over it? Because they're looking for a quantum computer, and you're saying, well, there's one right here in the body. So the worry.
His answer?
Well, I mean, it might be the right answer. He sort of said, well, that's sort of your fault, Max. And that's because Max Tegmark did write an influential paper suggesting that the decoherence rates in the brain are going to be far too fast for any quantum effects to be relevant there.
Mm.
Which I think is the default position, right? If you want to make a case for coherence, you have to somehow get around that using some clever tricks, or which may be the case.
You say that this is happening in plants with photosynthesis, right?
Yeah, that was one of my things I wanted to point out. But I guess but on a very, very short time scale. So it's not that there are full quantum computation is going on, but there is, in the chemical process itself, there is some quantum coherence going on, which maybe goes back to my original point that after all, chemistry is just quantum coherent, or quantum physics anyway. Right? And so,
This was one of their arguments: is if it's happening in plants, why not in the brain?
yes. Well, and that could also be true, right? It could. There is certainly some kind of quantum coherence on very, very short time scales. I think that's going to be true in many things all around us.
What time scales are we talking about when we talk about
femtosecond time scales, if I remember correctly.
And that's enough to like release or create a change, such as release an ion or do something.
Exactly. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier something I wanted to bring up, which is that there was this issue about consciousness, and you mentioned also free will. It brought to mind an interesting paper that was written maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and now I've even forgotten the names of the authors, but they're very distinguished scientists, and they had a paper called the Free Will Theorem, which they argued that if we have free will, human beings with our consciousness, that means particles have free will too. And so it has an interesting argument, but it could also be relevant for this kind of program you're envisioning.
Mm-hmm.
To look further into that. This was a bit like a Bell type test.
Yeah, I mean the idea of free will, and again looking into free will, is something that we actually are doing and have some funding to do. But it's a slippery slope. If you're not careful with what you do, you can actually again start talking about just like molecules having free will. We can also say that molecules have consciousness, and we can say all kinds of things like that. And you have to be very careful. You just have to put your brakes somewhere. You just have to sort of say, okay, how do we go about this in sort of a regimented fashion?
Yeah, I think you have to have a clear definition of what you're talking about, and then have evidence that if you're going to make that kind of claim, you have to have evidence that of some kind of experimental evidence that what you're talking about.
So one of the problems that's something that goes closer to Kelvin's domain, but it's not a definitional problem of what consciousness is. It's a lot of people approach consciousness by what it's not. It's just easier. So you say, well, consciousness is not that. So you show somebody that's not consciousness, and so on. But it's much more complicated to say what consciousness is. So when you talk about the redness of red or the wetness of water or all these things, that's cool, but it doesn't give a lot of people enough information about what is the nature of it, what it is that you're doing. And that's why I think it's very important to have philosophers on the team who can try to clarify some of these aspects a little bit. Do you find, by the way, Kelvin, that it's easier to sometimes say what consciousness isn't than what it is?
Yeah, I mean, one definition that is at least useful is it's the thing that goes away when you fall into dreamless sleep and then comes back again when you either wake up or start dreaming. Not a negative definition perhaps, but it's also, as you say, it doesn't really capture the nature of the thing. It's just a rough and ready operational definition, and it's very difficult to do any better than that.
Sleep is a point of reference.
Yeah, exactly. Dreamless sleep.